welcome to Real Hearts, Real Talk, presented by HeartKids, an event that has been exclusively designed for you. My name's Brihony Dawson. I'm going to be your master of ceremonies this evening. It is an honour and a privilege to be here with all of you. Before we begin, I would first like to acknowledge that I am hosting this virtual event from the lands of the Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung in Melbourne. And I also acknowledge the traditional custodians of the various lands on which you are all standing today, and the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people participating in this program. I pay my respect to the elders past, present and emerging, and celebrate the diversity of Aboriginal peoples and their ongoing cultures and connections to the lands and waters of Australia. Now, some of you might already be very familiar with HeartKids, while for others this could mark your very first connection with us. Regardless of where you stand, we hope that tonight you walk away with some key insights and make some new friendships along the way. So tonight we are joined by some healthcare professionals as well as HeartKids ambassadors as well, and we're also joined by an incredible live illustration artist, Jessime Gee. So I'd now like to introduce our very first speaker, Associate Professor Dominika Zentner. She's an adult cardiologist at the Royal Melbourne Hospital in Victoria. She runs the Cardiac Pregnancy Clinic and is part of the team that looks after adults with congenital heart disease. Please make Dominika feel welcome. With everyone's clapping for you, Dominika, back in their homes.
Thanks, Brihony.
Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for inviting me to HeartKids and everyone who's joined us online.
Excellent. So firstly, before we get into our questions, I'd love to just know a little bit more about what you do and sort of like what your day-to-day looks like. So
particularly the people online who come to the Royal Melbourne Hospital Clinic will know that we have a really large service. We look after about 3,500 people with congenital heart disease.
That's a lot of people.
It's a lot of people.
A lot of people.
And it's lovely because they're all adults. So, you know, we're getting to meet people with these conditions that we haven't perhaps had ability to look after and meet decades ago. So it is very privileged. So there's a very busy clinic that's run every week, and that's where we do most of our care really. But we also have a number of people who are in hospital with a heart condition, exacerbation or needing tests, or sometimes coming in with other health conditions, but we still want to know that they're in, excuse me, if they're one of our patients. So that's probably the bulk of my work in the adult congenital heart disease, or ACHD as we say, so it's shorter space. But I also run the Cardiac Pregnancy Clinic, which is really special, and that's a joint service with the Royal Women's Hospital. And so we look after women with heart disease through pregnancy and planned delivery, and we do that with the obstetric team, but sometimes also other health care professionals, just depending on what's required for that particular woman.
Yeah. It sounds like you're very busy.
Yeah, but it's lovely.
Yeah, excellent. Okay, so let's sort of get into it so we can get some really good information out to the people watching tonight. We'll start off with sort of like, how should a patient prepare for a cardiologist appointment? Like, what is, you know, should they be bringing information and notes in with them? Are they keeping a diary of symptoms and that kind of things? Are they writing down questions? And should they bring like a support person with them as well?
Okay, so I think, you know, most appointments are reviews, and so what we're really interested in is whether things have changed from when we've last seen somebody. So really keen to know how people are functionally. So for example, are they walking as far as they usually would? Have they got any new symptoms? Has something changed? We'll have some specific questions which will be a bit related to the different conditions, but really broadly we would usually ask about breathlessness, so shortness of breath, palpitations, feeling your heart race, particularly concerned about things such as passing out unexpectedly. And we want to know about medications. People are thinking about pregnancy. I think a list of questions is a really good idea, because I think in the stress of coming to an appointment, sometimes they just, you know, for all of us, they leave our head. And unless you've got a list, you walk out and go, oh, I really meant to ask. So I think that's really
good to be prepared.
Good. I think be prepared. I think a diary it's got to strike a balance. We don't want to turn people's entire life into focusing on their heart. We want people to live their lives, but keeping a diary, if you're trying to work out whether things are changing or there are new symptoms, I think is a really good sort of memory aid. And then what we're interested in is that burden of disease, not last Tuesday at 5 p.m. this happened, but more, look, I've been keeping a diary, and over the last few months I've noticed that most weeks I have a prolonged episode of palpitations, and that wasn't happening last year. That's really useful.
Okay, great.
The other bit you asked was about who to bring. I think whoever's right. So particularly at transition, so most adults come to us somewhere between sort of 16 to 20, really just depending often on other health conditions that they might have. So at the start, we often see people with one or both parents, but sometimes not. And then as people become older, often with a partner, and then perhaps down the track with a partner and a child, I think whoever's right for them is absolutely fine for us.
And I think also with a support person as well, with notes, it's good to take notes once you're getting information from your specialist as well, so that you're remembering that sort of stuff.
I've now for a few years actually been sending people my letters, so they get the same letter the GP gets.
Oh, great.
And that lets them hopefully just be more in the moment than trying to scribble down notes, but I think that's really important.
And how can people work with their cardiology team to establish like an actual personalised care plan which suits their unique needs?
I think it's really good for people to understand what the routine tests are, because that gives them an idea of, for example, you know, every 12 months I'm going to come in and see you or another cardiologist, and I'll have X and Y tests. If something changes, so what are the symptoms that I'm keeping an eye out for? And if those symptoms change, or if those routine tests change, what's next? So what are the tests that might be ordered if something changes? I think that gives people a nice sort of look into the future in terms of care. It's really hard to look at one person and say, I think in X amount of time you are going to need this done. But I think it's very reasonable to be asked, if there were lots of me, if you looked after, you know, if you had 100 people with this condition, what are you seeing? What is the future likely to hold? And having those understandings about the likelihood of a repeat intervention, for example, or what symptoms they might develop is really useful. I think it's handy for people to know what we want to know about, so what I call red flags. What's a change that I really want to know about, and you shouldn't wait until your next appointment. And if a change happens, am I going to feel it, or is the test going to tell you? Because there are some people where really the test will pick it up first. And I think that's good to know, because otherwise it can be a bit of a shock if someone feels totally unchanged. And yet they come in and we say, oh, actually, things have really changed and now we need to do something. So understanding what's going to be the first change, I think, can be useful.
Fabulous. And how does that all sort of tie in with their GP?
So I think a GP is really, I think we should all have a GP. Regardless of whether you have congenital heart disease or not.
Agreed.
Because you know, particularly with the way the Australian health system is, the GP is the glue that holds it all together.
The hub.
Absolutely. And getting in to see a specialist can often take a long time. I know we're very guilty of it being very difficult to get in urgently to clinic, and it is difficult. So I think a really good GP who knows your history and who knows how to contact people if they have questions is really important. And maintaining that communication is really important.
And can you see any cardiologist as your specialist doctor?
I think you should see a cardiologist who has particular training or particular expertise in congenital heart disease. So it's definitely a smaller number than all cardiologists, but there's actually been some work done looking at outcomes for people who are in general cardiology care or in specialist cardiology care, and outcomes are better for people looked after by specialist cardiologists in this area. So I think that's really important. Having said that, there would be some very minor conditions where we might be quite happy to share care, or perhaps review people for a while and then discharge them elsewhere, particularly if they live a long way away. But in general, it should be a specialist cardiologist.
Okay. And how do heart conditions from childhood impact things like ageing, and what can adults do to prepare for those sort of changes?
I think that's a really tricky question.
In all aspects.
So I think it's really tricky because I don't think we know, and in part, to come back to what I said at the start, we now have more adults living with congenital heart disease in Australia than children, but there are people surviving into their 40s, 50s, 60s. We've had some people into their 70s, but we haven't had that experience for decades. And so I don't know that we really know specifically about ageing and congenital heart disease well yet. We certainly see deterioration, for example, in valve function, or sometimes people have had what we call conduits, so connections or tubes between chambers and vessels in the heart put in, and they tend to deteriorate with time. And we can see if people's hearts don't function properly, that again, that tends to deteriorate with time. How much that's time related and how much that's an ageing consequence, I'm not sure that we know. But we all live in a society where, as we age, we're much more likely to run into trouble with things like diabetes and high blood pressure and coronary disease and obesity. And so I think there's a real role for looking after oneself really well, because adding in other insults to the cardiovascular system is not a good thing. So it's going to sound very daggy. But I guess my general advice to some extent would be what I would say to most, to everybody, which is be the best you can. So eat, a really well-balanced diet, make sure you're normal weight, try and avoid things like high blood pressure, diabetes if you can, through lifestyle changes, avoiding obesity. I think all those general things are going to be really important, but I don't think we have excellent data yet about ageing. And I guess the only other thing I would reflect is that there might be some people on the call who've had quite significant congenital heart disease, spent a lot of their childhood and teenage years, for example, in hospital or quite physically limited. And if they've never had a chance to develop their strongest, for example, bone density and their best lung capacity and their best muscle mass, we all lose that as we get older. And so whether perhaps ageing will have a greater effect on people who've not managed to be their best at the start because of everything else that was going on.
Interesting. And what advice do you give to patients who are preparing to travel? Obviously, people want to try and live normal lives and get out and see some things. You're travelling interstate, but also overseas. How do people look after themselves the best there?
So I think interstate, we've got people online from all around Australia. So interstate is easier because it's a health system people will know, and it's in English, and we're usually in a similar time zone, and you can get in touch with your usual cardiologist. Travelling overseas, I think for most people is fine. There would be some people where I'd be concerned about very remote areas or very high altitude areas. So, but I think most of those adults would probably know who they were and would be careful about just having a chat to their cardiologist. I think it's really wise to travel with a letter. It doesn't have to be extensive, but something that says what your condition is, the operations that you've had, what medications you're on, and the last test results, and a contact about if you end up in a hospital overseas, how do they make contact with us?
That makes a lot of sense.
And so you shouldn't feel bad about asking a cardiologist to do that for you. I think that's fine. And I actually had this question a little while ago, and you can have a look, I think it's called ACHD Travel Directory online. It's put out through the state, so it's very American-centric, but it does include a lot of other countries in the world. And has details about where ACHD services are. Oh, wow, great. So I know there are errors because I then looked up the Royal Melbourne and it's the wrong phone number. Okay. But at least it will give you a name of a hospital, and that would be a good hospital, for example, emergency department to go to. So you can do that. Okay, excellent.
So let's talk about pregnancy now. What do people with CoHD need to know about pregnancy?
Okay. So there are the bits that for me are the same as for everybody else, and that is that I think that pregnancy should be something that people make a really positive decision about. So if they want to get pregnant and when they want to get pregnant, I think that allows everyone to have a conversation about the health areas that are important for all of us. So vaccinations up to date, folate month before conception, first 3 months.
Yeah.
Being the best weight you can be, as healthy as you can be, stop smoking and vaping and drinking and all that.
Yeah.
So I think all that's really important. But for people with congenital heart disease, and I guess we're now mainly thinking about women with congenital heart disease who are going to carry a pregnancy, really important to have preconception counselling.
Yeah.
And that should be a conversation with the cardiologist, and possibly more than one conversation. Sometimes that's something that we might revisit over some years.
Mm-hmm.
And really an opportunity to try and get the best information about what the risks are, and to understand whether there's anything that needs to happen in terms of your heart health before you get pregnant.
Yeah.
Because for some people we might advise an operation or an intervention to make things safer.
Yeah.
Everyone's different in terms of how much risk they're willing to put themselves through.
Yeah.
And how important it is to have a child for their sense of self.
Yeah.
And so I try very hard to support. I do occasionally advise against pregnancy.
Yeah.
But even if I've advised against pregnancy, if someone chooses to get pregnant, I will still look after them. And occasionally we do advise termination, which is a really hard decision.
Yeah.
And I will always involve another cardiologist because I think it's such a huge piece of advice to give somebody. But sometimes we think it is just too risky, but that is the smaller proportion, and most people can have a baby.
Yeah.
And then just to remember, but it's often actually the bit that people online who I see ask me about first, and it's really interesting when people are thinking about having a baby, most of their concerns are about the baby.
Yeah.
And usually it's a concern about passing on congenital heart disease. Yeah. And that is at an increased risk, whether it's mum or dad who has the congenital heart disease. But unless there's a broader syndrome, or we've found a particular genetic cause, or there's a family history of congenital heart disease, for most people the risk is not enormous.
Yeah.
It is an increased risk compared to the background risk, but perhaps much smaller than people fear might be.
And how do people prepare for a healthy pregnancy?
I think probably some of the stuff I said before, just in terms of, normal weight.
Yeah.
Thinking about folate, giving up cigarettes, etc. Most of my patients don't smoke, thank you. Just to, but, and I think being fit as you can be is actually worthwhile. We put a lot of weight on how functionally well people are. So if people can do a significant amount of exercise, it gives me some confidence that pregnancy, which is a bit like an endurance race, is something that their heart is going to be able to cope with. So, yeah.
And is the only option to have a cesarean when people have CoHD?
No.
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 We can do it any which way we like.
Well, we try really hard to work for a vaginal birth.
Yeah.
We don't always get there. We often make that the plan, but not necessarily get there. But it's definitely not a given that people will need a caesarean section. And I guess also just really important to understand that there might be other reasons, so obstetric reasons or baby reasons for why women have caesarean sections, and also a small number of women who make that choice. Yeah. But no, we would try really hard to plan for a vaginal birth if we think that's possible.
Great. And I understand as well that people with CoHD, falling pregnant can look quite different for some people. What can people do if they're told they can't have children because of their CoHD?
So I think probably the word is should not, as opposed to cannot.
Yeah, cannot. We're told they should not.
Because we've certainly had, I've certainly heard of someone who was told they could not, who did then conceive and had presumed, quite understandably, that the conversation was that she was infertile. So most people with congenital heart disease, we think are fertile. Yeah. There are certainly some people where some of the more significant congenital heart diseases, so as I guess for any chronic condition, infertility seems to be more common. But for most people, we would hope that they would be able to have a pregnancy. If you are advised against pregnancy and agree to that because of the risks for your own health, the options really in Australia are around surrogacy and adoption, and I'm not probably the best person to talk about those in great detail, except to say that surrogacy in Australia is different to other countries, so you can't enter into a paid surrogacy agreement here in Australia. You have to find someone willing to be a surrogate. So what I mean by surrogate, to people online, is to carry the pregnancy for you and to give birth to the baby for you. And that has to be an altruistic arrangement. So it often ends up being a close relative. Overseas, there are other opportunities. And adoption, which, again, I understand is very, very difficult in Australia, but unfortunately, I'm probably not the best person to give you more details about that. But would be very happy to refer people on if that was, what we were looking at, obviously.
So talking about now about, sort of more preventing and terminating pregnancy, who's the best person to talk to about contraception, and why is that something that's so important when you have CoHD?
So I think, again, for me, that the most important reason for contraception is because I really believe that you are the only person who should decide when, if and when you want to get pregnant. So I think that's really important for everybody. And I should just point out that contraception is obviously what people use, so as not to conceive a baby. But most contraception, other than condoms, doesn't protect us from sexually transmitted diseases. So we're leaving aside that side of things as well. For most women with congenital heart disease, most forms of contraception are okay. They do have varying degrees of efficacy, and the one that there are some congenital heart diseases where we do worry about this particular contraception would be the oral combined pill, which is probably what is mostly used, so people might be a bit surprised about that. That's because it contains estrogen and increases the risk of clots, and so for some of our women we would advise against that. But the long-acting contraceptions, which are really efficacious, so an IUD or Implanon, which is the rod under the skin, are really good, pretty almost for anyone that we would look after.
Okay, great. Sorry,
I was just going to say,
go.
Do just check with your cardiologist, because there are, with the Implanon, I think there are some medications where it doesn't work as well. So do just check.
Great. And last question before we wrap up. How can someone manage an unwanted or an unsafe pregnancy, and where could someone with CoHD go to get that help? And what advice do you have for young adults who are seeking a termination?
I think firstly, just to really recognise that I don't think anyone makes that decision lightly. And even if it is the right decision for somebody, that it can still be accompanied by a huge amount of grief. So really important, if you can, to get support, friends, family, professional support, because I don't think it's ever easy. The GP would be a really good first port of call. Also your local obstetric hospital. So for example, I know there's some information on the Royal Women's Hospital website, because I've looked through that for other reasons, but I would imagine that that's probably the case for a lot of the obstetric hospitals in Australia. Family planning online as well can give you some information. And termination you should be able to access in Australia, and if you go and talk to somebody, there are some healthcare professionals who might not be comfortable talking about termination, but they are legally required to refer you to somebody who is. So you should never be met with a closed door. And if you have any concerns or about how that termination is going to happen and where that termination should happen because of your congenital heart disease, I would have a chat to your cardiologist. I think that's a completely fair, very sensible question.
Great. We have had some questions come direct to you from people at home. Thank you very much for your questions. We do have time for 2 questions if we can. How do you see a specialist cardiologist in the public system?
Ask your GP to refer you. So HeartKids, I'm almost 100% certain, does have a list of all the different congenital centres in Australia, and your GP should be able to refer you directly in.
Great.
But if whoever asked the question doesn't have any joy, I think they could contact HeartKids, about from where they're, geographically located.
Great. And question number 2, is there statistics or studies that show a significant difference in outcomes between private and public?
Oh, I don't know. I don't know. So that's an interesting question. In Victoria, we run very much a public-based ACHD service.
Yeah.
In New South Wales, I understand it's more privately based. But no, the research I'm aware of is really the difference between a general cardiologist and an ACHD cardiologist, not between whether it's public
or private.
and private. Yeah.
We do have one more question for you that just popped it in here. Do you recommend IVF to allow patients to have pre-implantation genetic diagnosis, if available for their condition, as it can be for Marfan syndrome?
So again, I keep hitting the microphone. I give people options.
Yeah.
I think it's a really personal decision. I think for anyone who has a genetic diagnosis, if they are interested in not passing that genetic diagnosis on, absolutely that option exists. But I would never say, if I were you, I think you should do this.
Yeah.
It's really different. And I can't predict. I've spoken to people who have wanted to pursue that and to people who have not. And I'm not able, I assumed that it would reflect the experience they had had with their condition from where I stood.
Yep.
But I can't pick it. I think it's really personal, but absolutely. And again, you should be able to get your cardiologist or your GP to refer you if that matters to you.
Great. Cardiologist or GP, folks.
Yep.
This will answer a lot of your questions there. And thank you for all of your questions, for sending them in. If we haven't been able to answer your questions today on our virtual from the stage managers, they're making a note of all of your questions, and the HeartKids teams will respond to you with helpful information after the event. Thank you very much, Dominica. Thank you. Appreciate it. I'm sure everyone's clapping you at home. Thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciate it.
My pleasure.
Okay, some fantastic information there. Thank you, Dominica. That was absolutely fascinating, and some really good practical information there that I hope you've all received at home. Okay, we're going to welcome back Dr. Charlotte Verrill, and we're going to introduce you to Dr. Derek Tran. Derek is a lecturer at the University of Sydney School of Medicine and senior exercise physiologist at the Royal Prince Alfred Hospital, with research focusing on cardiopulmonary exercise. Derek also co-coordinates the Congenital Heart Fitness Intervention Trial. Welcome, Derek. We also have Amber Adamson. Amber is the acting adult congenital heart disease clinical nurse consultant at the Prince Charles Hospital, where she has cared for congenital heart patients since she was a new graduate. Welcome, Amber. And finally, but certainly not last, a founder of Adulting Well, Elle Pendrick. Elle is dedicated to empowering people navigating life with chronic illness to thrive in every aspect. With a personal journey shaped by congenital heart disease, she's embarked on a mission to transform challenges into opportunities. Sounds awesome. Thanks for joining us, Elle, and thank you to everyone for joining us on our panel discussion. You can say hello, guys. You put
Hi.
on your... There you go.
Thank you for having us.
Welcome, Derek. Have we got you?
I do, I believe. Can you hear me?
Hello. All right, let's kick things off here. As young adults living with congenital heart conditions, what are some practical strategies or tips each of you can suggest for them to help maintain a balanced and healthy lifestyle, considering both physical and mental health aspects? Let's start with you first, Elle.
That is a cracker of a question, and it's, I wouldn't say after 4 decades of living with CHD I've cracked the code yet, but I would definitely say mental health. Mental health is number one. So thanks, Charlotte, for everything that you shared. It was really helpful. And I think for some of us who've had a lot of intensive surgeries and things like that, getting the right kind of mental health support is really important. So I've been to employee assistance programs, I've been through mental health care plan with the GP, and one thing that really helped me was trauma therapy. So you've got to keep going until you find what works for you. And my number one tip is kind of approach it like dating. If you don't kind of gel with them, then maybe they're not for you. Dump them. Go find someone else that you gel with.
That is the best analogy I think I've ever heard. I really, really love that. I love it. Amber, let's go to you next.
Mine would probably be physical, just from the nursing side of things. So just be compliant with those medications. I promise you're on them for a reason. If they don't work for you, or you're getting really awful side effects to the point that you don't want to take them, don't just stop taking them. Come see us, give us a call, talk to your congenital cardiologist. Let's work out something that's going to suit you better. Let's trial something else. But from my perspective, to improve, living with CHD is just be compliant with those medications, please.
Take your medications, kids. Okay.
Please.
Derek.
I'm going to stick in my lane with exercise as well. And I think I agree with Elle. I think the most important thing is pick something you enjoy and try and find something you enjoy, and really trial a whole range of different things. And once you do, I think that's the best kind of approach to maintaining a healthy lifestyle.
I'm finding a theme running here, and it's like, do what works best for you. Find out what is the best thing for you and go and do it. Charlotte?
I will have to choose mental health as well. However, as mentioned in the talk, don't think physical and mental health are separate. I think lots of what we do to support our mental health may include physical activity and vice versa. I think they're two things that really feed into each other. And in terms of Al's comment about the therapy, I have to support what she said, and also let everybody know that as a healthcare professional who works in mental health, we're trained to take the dumping. So if you feel that somebody's not right for you, don't worry about the feelings of the therapist. This is all about making sure you are getting the right support for what you're going through. So take away any feelings of discomfort, and that's a good boundary to practice as well.
Juicy boundaries again. Excellent. Amber, this one is for you. Drugs and alcohol with a congenital heart condition. How bad is it? And vaping. Put vaping in there as well.
Oh, yeah. I mean, vaping's like a hot topic at the moment, right? It's all over the news. They're like banning it. You've got to go to pharmacies only now to get them, and all of this thing that's going on, which there's a reason for that. Look, I mean, you're young, right? Like, we've all been there, whatever. Like, no one's here to judge you. Growing up, you're going to be around that. You're going to go out with your friends, go to the nightlife. If that's your thing, you're going to be surrounded by drugs, surrounded by alcohol. There's going to be temptations. It's a part of growing up when you're 18 or younger, whatever. Not ideal, let's be honest. I mean, no one in the sort of healthcare industry is going to be really for it, but like everything in moderation. I mean, more so from an alcohol perspective, everything in moderation. Too much alcohol, regardless of whether you've got a congenital heart disease or not, can have really awful side effects, palpitations, things like that, electrolyte deficiencies. Like, these are all just things that are just going to like set you up for someone that doesn't have the strongest heart to sort of end up in emergency and things like that. And drugs, like, there's just a big no. I mean, look, at the end of the day, if you're going to do it, you're going to do it. Like, no amount of advice will stop you. But just be honest about it, like at your appointment. Especially no, like the biggest no to injectable drugs. Yeah, it's an uncomfortable conversation sometimes to have, but it's a really necessary one, because you worry about the risk of infective endocarditis with patients in the congenital heart cohort. So it'll go hand in hand with people with tattoos and piercings. So anything where you're injecting the skin, there's the risk of introducing bacteria, and that will travel up into your heart valves, the endocardium that surrounds the heart, the inner lining of the heart, inflammation, infection. It can sort of go on to your ICDs, your pacemakers, all sorts of things. So, Yeah, I mean, everything in moderation, but if I can sort of warn against anything, definitely avoid injectables by any means. But otherwise, yeah, stick to a sort of moderated amount with the alcohol. Don't go too hard. I know it's hard to not be influenced by your friends, especially when you're sort of just getting onto that party scene and going out and wanting to live a normal life. And I think from a mental health aspect, it is important to sort of live a normal life. You know, you want to go out
Yeah.
with your friends and enjoy all that and whatever. So we're never going to sit here and be like, do not drink. But like, you know, it's just the safety thing, like have water, replace your electrolytes, like don't go too hard. And with the drugs, I mean, if anything, drugs are going to induce arrhythmias, palpitations, you know, they're going to dehydrate, all sorts of kind of things. Like, so definitely no to drugs, certainly no to injectables, but alcohol, everything in moderation.
No drugs, no injectables, alcohol in moderation.
Yeah,
And
for
vaping,
sure.
just chuck it out, get rid of it.
Yeah, let's be honest, it's not going to be good for you. I mean, I think people were trying to just find like a better alternative to smoking, but like, we're sort of the more research that's coming out, you know, we're finding it's just as bad. So there's a
Yeah.
reason why they're sort of wanting to introduce that to being able to only buy into pharmacies.
Yeah.
So that you can have that discussion with a healthcare professional in a place that also sells like nicotine replacement therapies to help you quit that sort of side of things. But
Yeah.
you know, anything that you're inhaling into the lungs that you don't know the proper contents of, not ideal ever. But again, people are going to do it, and we're never here to judge you. Like, always just speak up and let us know that that's something that you do. Because with anything, like even people who smoke, like we like to know about it because it can affect like the capacity of how you recover from like cardiac surgery and all those kind of things, right? Like it's going to impact your lungs and how you recover. So just always be honest about it. But at the end of the day, we'll never stop you from living your life. We'll just be there to support you when you need.
Well said, Amber. Thank you. Next question's for you, Derek. How do people talk to their PTs about having a heart condition and more specifically with a pacemaker as well?
So that's a really good question. So I think the really important thing is selecting an appropriate exercise professional to have that conversation with. A lot of times people will go to a PT to try and have that conversation, but PTs aren't necessarily trained to provide that advice and information, and we prefer and recommend people go to an exercise physiologist to actually have that information. It's really important that you have the documents because every ICD and every device is actually different, and it'll be really important that the exercise professional communicates with the cardiologist to find out what device settings are actually set at. And there may be times you actually need to potentially modify those settings if it's not working for you, especially as you are working in an exercise session. It's really important with ICDs. I think that you know what the upper limit is and you're exercising below that as well.
Thanks, Derek. It sounds like there's a running theme here, and it's like make sure everyone that you're working with is on the same page. Like communication is really important, and everyone needs the same data to be able to look after you properly.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Can I just echo what Derek said? Because, you know, I've been there with the, you know, went down the road and thought, yeah, I'll do CrossFit with the local PT, and it went very, very wrong. But yeah, the research and stuff that Derek and his team is doing is incredible. And my life changed when I went and saw an exercise physiologist instead of a regular PT or someone that I, you know, just found on Facebook or something, but someone who's registered, and there is a full register for that. And I think HeartKids, people correct me if I'm wrong, but are there EPs on the health professional database that you have?
This might be one for Jess Keating. I think we do. I do believe we do have them on our directory. So our HeartKids directory is available on our website. So if you just search directory in the search bar there, or we can put a link to it in our follow-up comms as well.
Hello, welcome Becky from HeartKids.
Hi. How you going? Sorry to pop into the panel. You can exit me out now.
It's great to have you.
Okay, bye.
So this question has come from someone on Slido. I found that all cardiac services and support for me in rural New South Wales are focused on older people with heart conditions. How can adults with a congenital heart condition that live regionally or remotely access the specialised support and services they need locally, or will they always have to travel?
So
I mean, we just do telehealth. Sorry, we have telehealth in Queensland, so we would just utilise that for our rural patients if necessary. But that was what I had to say. Sorry, guys. You might know a bit better.
I think I agree. We're working on that as well, even from an exercise perspective, is to try and establish a service that can be accessed by everyone across Australia if we can.
Yeah, unfortunately, the reality is there's only, correct me if I'm wrong, about 8, maybe 12 adult specialist cardiologists for congenital heart disease, and they don't live in Wagga Wagga where I grew up. They don't live in regional New South Wales, and they don't live in Cairns. They live in Sydney and Melbourne, and maybe Brisbane as well. And you know, I live in Canberra. I grew up in Wagga, and I still travel to Sydney for my annual appointments. And if I can do telehealth, I will. I will say that they are really quite flexible. The cardiologists that I've seen as an adult, if you've got a question, they'll take emails, they'll try and help you before making you shift all the way to the big smoke to try and have an appointment. There's also like free schemes that you can tap into in your state and territory to get assistance for the cost to go and do that. And really, I think living in a regional area, I don't live in a rural area, I live in regional, but it's this digital connection that is really where it's at for the healthcare, but also for your mental health and everything. Like doing things like this is digital, you can do it anywhere, and it's really amazing.
Excellent. Okay, Charlotte, I have one for you. This is an interesting one. How do I encourage my parents to let me have more independence?
This is an interesting one, and I think it's a challenging one both for the now adult child, but also for the parents. And I think that's something that it's a process for both of you, and it is a process. It's not suddenly one day you hit your 18th birthday and that's it. You're going to take over everything and grab those reins. What's encouraged is that this is an approach sort of based like a slow approach is taken with this, where you know your parent is responsible for your healthcare and likely has done all of that for you, and you've just walked up to the appointments with them. And then you get to this age where you know perhaps it's a process of them helping you schedule your appointments, but they'll come along with you, for example. And slowly it's kind of a transition phase of your parent becoming a support rather than the manager of your healthcare, and taking that step back. So this advice is for parents out there as well. And I think where possible, having an open line of communication with your parents and trying to tell them when you're ready to take the next step, and when you want to maybe take on a bit more autonomy, and what that looks like for you. Because again, this is really different for everybody, and people will feel ready for this at different time points, and especially depending if there's particular things going on in their life. And also if there are things going on and you maybe want a bit of extra support, trying to be open about that with either your parents or even a friend if you're happy for them to give you that support, or somebody that you trust. I think that would be kind of my main sort of takeaway around that one.
There might be times when parents don't feel ready yet either.
I think so. Yeah. So I'm talking to both parties when I say.
Yeah. Elle, this one's for you from Slido. Everything is so expensive. Are there government subsidies that people can access to reduce costs?
Well, yes, there are. And here's some information I prepared earlier, just in case. And I'll talk about more in my breakout group as well. But there are loads. You should never, ever, ever have to miss out on your medication or an appointment or a procedure or anything like that because you think cost is a barrier. And a couple of key things are we live in Australia, we've got Medicare. Medicare is absolutely incredible. It's not perfect. It doesn't cover absolutely everything, but it is really incredible. It's I can go into it in more detail in the breakout group, but you can also have a look at the different types of schemes under Medicare, so they can give you partial or full bulk billing for your GP appointments, which basically means that they pay for it in whole or part of, which is helpful. They can also subsidise certain types of medication that you get on a script. And there's also safety nets. So if you spend a certain amount out of pocket, then you will hit a safety net, which kind of changes. And then it will go into different, it'll hit a safety net. And then once it hits a safety net, your costs will dramatically decrease because the amount that the government chips in increases, which is awesome. But you've got to spend a couple of grand out of your own pocket before you hit that. There's also public hospitals, which are fantastic. Those travel assistance schemes that I mentioned just before, they're called PATS, Patient Assistance Travel. Each state and territory has one. And depending on where you're at with your income, there's also healthcare cards from Centrelink. And one of the best ways to find cheap healthcare or a subsidized healthcare is to look at Health Direct website, and they have a service finder. And in the service finder, you can type what kind of, say you're looking for a GP or a psychologist or an exercise physiologist or whatever it is. And you can ask for ones that are bulk billed, and it will tell you what's in your area, which is great. And then you can also contact amazing charities like HeartKids and things like that. If you're in an emergency situation and you've had to go to hospital, then you can certainly reach out to them. They're incredible and very helpful. And I will say this goes against kind of the trying to move away from your parents and being an adult, but the World Bank of Mum and Dad, I used it a lot in my 20s. You know, I'm 41 now, I don't use it so much, but I would, look, don't be too proud to use it. Your parents have propped you up your entire life till then. And if they are in a position, and I fully respect that not every parent is, but as they say, because he lives, then go back to the World Bank of Mum and Dad.
I've made many withdrawals from the Bank of Mum and Dad over my time. So, yes, I believe in that financial institution wholeheartedly. We've got time for one last question. This one goes to Derek. This is from Slido. I don't exercise. How do I start or know how to exercise safely for my condition?
I think starting is always a good question. I think your starting point realistically is always to have the first conversation with your cardiologist to actually, so they can actually appropriately screen you and conduct any routine tests that may actually be needed. Besides from that, once that actually has occurred, you can get referred to an exercise physiologist, but you also can just start engaging in really simple programs like walking, which are really great for you. And so about, again, trying to find something that you really do enjoy and trying to stick to that. But like, I'm a really big advocate of walking programs where, you know, you find a really nice walking track and you can walk a bit faster at some places, walk up a hill, go up some stairs, and you can really tailor it to your own individual current fitness levels anyway. And once you want to be a little bit more specific, then yeah, go ahead and see an exercise physiologist or try a few different activities that you may really enjoy.
Awesome. Thanks for that, Derek. Okay, well, we're going to wrap up our panel now, but very shortly we're going to be going into our breakout groups. So thank you very much, Charlotte, Derek, Elle and Amber. Big virtual round of applause for all of you. It's really insightful information there, so thank you. Okay, we're going to cross over to our friend Jessime and see how she's tracking with our illustration. We saw it briefly on the break, but she's doing an absolute ripper job and I can't wait to see how it's looking now. Look at that. Look at the detail in there. Fantastic. There's so much stuff in there. Exercise. Oh yeah, drugs and alcohol and vaping and the balanced and healthy lifestyle, setting those juicy boundaries for all of you.